On Christmas Eve in 1874, a few miles north of Oxford, a train carrying several hundred people home for the holiday ran off the rails and down an embankment into the freezing waters of a canal. 34 people did not survive it. 69 more were carried away injured, some of them children. Among the dead was a 5-year-old girl travelling with her mother to spend Christmas with family. Her 2-year-old sister survived, but no one at the scene knew who she was. There was no storm that day. There was no act of war, no act of God, no collision with another train. There was only a single metal tyre, fitted to a single carriage, wearing thin in a way that nobody in 1874 yet knew how to detect, on a train that had no way to stop itself quickly and no way for the passengers at the back to warn the men driving at the front. You have probably never heard of it. It happened a decade and a half before the law that would have prevented it. To understand how an ordinary Christmas Eve express, carrying families home for the holiday, became one of the worst railway disasters Britain had seen up to that date, you first have to understand what an ordinary journey home looked like in 1874, and what exactly the men who ran Britain's railways already knew and had chosen not to fix. Before we go on, this channel is just getting started, so if these forgotten corners of Victorian Britain are the kind of history you enjoy, take a moment to subscribe so the next one finds you, and tell me in the comments where in the world you are watching from. Oxfordshire in the 1870s was a county still built around the rhythms of farmland and market towns, and the railway had only recently begun to reorder those rhythms. The Great Western Railway's line from Oxford north to Birmingham, running through Banbury, was by then well established, but it had only in January of 1873 gained a new tributary, the East Gloucestershire Railway's branch line to Fairford, out in the quiet country toward the Wiltshire and Gloucestershire border. That branch line mattered because it fed passengers from small rural parishes onto the Great Trunk Line at Oxford, and it was that branch which, on the 24th of December 1874, carried a mother and her 2 young daughters into the story. Her name was Sarah Yates. She was 36 years old, born in the village of Filkins near Lechlade in 1838, and in 1857 she had married a man named William Yates at Highworth in Wiltshire. By the winter of 1874, the couple were settled in the village of Hannington, where William kept the public house known as the Dog. It was the kind of small fixed known place that made up most of rural England at the time. A single street, a single church, a single inn, and a web of family relations that had not much changed in a generation. Sarah and William had already buried one child. Their daughter Mary Jane had died only 9 months earlier, in the spring of that same year, and was laid to rest in the churchyard at Hannington. That is the kind of fact a family carries quietly into a season that is supposed to be about togetherness, and it is worth holding in mind as the story goes on. Because on Christmas Eve of 1874, Sarah Yates was travelling with her 2 youngest children, 5-year-old Fanny and 2-year-old Lizzie, north toward Wolverhampton to spend Christmas with relatives. William stayed behind at the inn. It was to be, in every way anyone could have expected, an ordinary family Christmas journey. A mother, 2 small daughters, a change of trains at Oxford, and a house full of relatives waiting at the other end. To get there, the family would have joined one of the year's busiest services, the 10 o'clock express from Paddington to Birkenhead, a train that on a normal day was simply the fastest way north out of London, but on Christmas Eve became something closer to a moving crowd. By the time it reached Reading, the train was already so full that 2 additional carriages had to be found and coupled on. It arrived into Oxford still overflowing, and station staff there discovered they needed yet another carriage to take the overspill of third-class passengers who could not otherwise be seated. So a further carriage was found, coupled onto the train, and the journey continued. That single decision, made under pressure, on the busiest travel day of the year, by ordinary railway staff simply trying to get everybody home for Christmas would turn out to matter more than anyone at Oxford Station that morning could possibly have known. The carriage found to solve Oxford's overcrowding problem was numbered 845. It was old. It had been built in 1855, nearly 20 years before, and although it had been fitted with new wheels, in 1868 its underlying design belonged to an earlier and less careful era of railway engineering than most of the rolling stock now running on the Great Western's main lines. It had been working without incident on another line only the week before. There was nothing about it to look at that marked it out as dangerous. It was simply old, and it was simply available, and on a morning when a company was scrambling to move an unusually large number of paying, festive, expectant passengers, old and available was good enough. It was coupled in directly behind the two engines pulling the train that day, a decision made for practical reasons of weight distribution and nothing more. A second engine had also been added at Oxford because railway staff judged, correctly as it turned out, that a single engine would struggle to haul the now heavier train up the inclines ahead in the icy December conditions. Snow lay on the ground, ice glazed the rails. It was, by any measure, hard weather for railway travel, and the men managing the Oxford to Birmingham line that day were making sound, sensible, entirely defensible decisions in response to it. None of those decisions was reckless. That is worth sitting with for a moment, because it is tempting, looking back from a safer age, to imagine that disasters like this one must have begun with someone doing something obviously wrong. They did not. They began with ordinary people making ordinary, reasonable choices on top of a system that had already been told by its own engineers and by the men who inspected it after previous accidents that it was carrying two structural weaknesses it had simply chosen not to fix. The first weakness was mechanical, and it lived quietly inside the wheel of carriage 845. A wheel of that era was built with an iron tyre shrunk onto a wooden or iron centre, and like any piece of metal put under repeated stress, it could develop what engineers now call fatigue, a hairline crack, invisible from the outside, that grows a little further with every rotation, every jolt, every mile. In 1874, the science of metal fatigue barely existed as a named idea. There was no test that could have found the crack inside that tyre. No inspector's method that would have flagged it, no regulation requiring the kind of scrutiny that might, in a later century, have caught it. The men who checked that carriage over in the days before Christmas were not negligent. They simply did not have the knowledge to see what was already happening inside the metal beneath their feet. The second weakness was not mechanical at all. It was organisational, and it had been known and named for years before that Christmas Eve. British passenger trains in 1874 had no continuous brake. Each carriage carried its own separate handbrake, and the locomotive carried its own brake, and there was no way to connect them so that a single action by a single person could bring every wheel of the train to a stop at once. If something went wrong at the front, there was no way to instantly halt the carriages at the back. If something went wrong at the back, the driver, 300 yards ahead and separated by the deafening noise of his own engine, might have no idea anything was wrong at all. That was the third weakness, and it sat directly on top of the second. The only method of communication between a guard riding at the rear of a train and a driver at the front was a cord that ran the length of the carriages to a gong near the engine, a system that depended on someone noticing trouble immediately, pulling hard enough, and the driver hearing and correctly interpreting a single ringing bell over the roar of his own locomotive. It was not a system built for urgency. It was a system built for a slower, gentler idea of what could go wrong on a railway, and by 1874, that idea was already out of date. None of this was secret. Engineers had been raising exactly these concerns for years, in trade journals, in evidence to previous inquiries, in the quiet, professional grumbling of men who serviced this equipment every day and could feel its limits. Continuous brakes were not a hypothetical technology Designs already existed, some already running on other lines in other countries and in a handful of experimental British trials. What did not yet exist was any law compelling a company the size of the Great Western Railway to fit them. Adopting new brakes and a new communication system cost money, required retrofitting an entire fleet of rolling stock, and was in the calculus that guided most Victorian railway companies, a matter of commercial discretion rather than urgent necessity. Nobody had been killed on this particular stretch of line before. Nothing forced anyone's hand. So the Great Western Railway, like almost every other passenger railway company in Britain that Christmas, ran its trains exactly as it always had. Old and new carriages mixed together as the day's crowding demanded. Hand brakes worked independently, by hand, and a cord and a gong standing in for anything faster or more certain. It was not recklessness, it was simply how the whole industry did business. On a day when the whole industry was straining to move as many people home for Christmas as it possibly could. The morning of the 24th of December 1874 looked in every respect like any other Christmas Eve on the Great Western Line. At Oxford Station, porters worked quickly through a crush of holiday luggage. Parcels wrapped in brown paper, hampers, small trunks, children clutching whatever they had been allowed to bring. The platform would have carried the particular noise of a Victorian station at its busiest time of year, hissing steam, shouted departures, the calls of relatives seeing off relatives, all of it folded into the general good humour of a day when almost everyone travelling was travelling toward family. The train that finally pulled out of Oxford at 12:15 was by any measure a long one. 2 engines at its head. Behind them carriage 845, then 2 first-class carriages, 2 second-class, 6 third-class, 2 composite carriages carrying a mixture of classes, and 3 brake vans strung through and behind them. 15 vehicles, in all trailing back along the line. It left Oxford some 35 minutes behind its scheduled time, delayed by exactly the kind of overcrowding that had put carriage 845 onto the train in the first place. Somewhere among those crowded compartments sat Sarah Yates, with Fanny and Lizzie beside her, having changed at Oxford from the branch line that had carried them up from the Fairford direction that morning. Exactly which carriage the family occupied was never recorded for certain. What is known is that the worst of what followed centred on the front of the train, closest to the engines, precisely where carriage 845 had been placed. The train pulled away from Oxford and out past the edges of the city, through Kidlington and into open country, gathering speed as it went, likely close to 40 miles an hour, a reasonable pace for the conditions, with ice and old snow still lying along the cutting and the frost, hard in the ground. Fields lay white and empty on either side. It was, for the passengers aboard, simply the last uneventful stretch of a long day's travel, 6 miles of ordinary Oxfordshire countryside between them and the next stop toward home. It was somewhere along that 6 miles, as the train approached the village of Shipton on Cherwell, that passengers in the leading carriages began to notice it. An unusual vibration, faint at first, running up through the floor of a compartment that had been perfectly steady moments before. It grew. It was not violent, not yet, not the kind of thing that would send anyone leaping for a window, but it was wrong, and anyone who had made this journey before would have known it. Something under the train somewhere near the front had begun to fail. The tyre on carriage 845 had cracked. Somewhere beneath the passengers seated closest to the engines, the floor that had been growing invisibly inside that metal for who knows how long finally gave way, and a wheel that should have carried its full share of weight along the rail began instead to run broken, still upright, still within the rails, but no longer whole. For a moment, nothing more happened. The carriage held its place in the line, rattling along at speed, its passengers feeling only that strange vibration, not yet understanding what it meant. The train was crossing the bridge over the River Cherwell at that moment, and the broken carriage continued to run, still between the rails, for something close to 300 yards, carried forward by its own momentum and the momentum of the engines ahead of it. Somewhere in that stretch, a guard or a passenger tried to raise the alarm. Exactly who first understood that something was badly wrong has not survived in any record, but someone did try to signal forward, pulling whatever cord or leaning from whatever window was available to them, in the hope that a driver 300 yards ahead, separated by 2 engines worth of noise and distance, might somehow hear it in time. It was not in time. By the moment a driver noticed the trouble and began to apply what brake he had, carriage 845 had already passed the bridge over the Oxford Canal, and there, on an embankment standing some 16 feet above the frozen water below, the wheel finally failed completely. The carriage left the rails. What followed took only seconds, though it must have felt far longer to the people living through it. The stricken carriage, already unbalanced, dragged against the couplings holding it to the rest of the train, and the heavier carriages running in behind it, unable to stop, ran directly into the wreckage forming ahead of them. 845 was destroyed almost entirely in that first collision, crushed between the momentum of the train behind it and the resistance of the embankment beneath it. The 2 engines lighter on their wheels and further ahead of the point of failure stayed on the rails and came to a stop further up the line, their crews suddenly aware that something enormous had happened somewhere behind them, without yet knowing what. Behind the engines, carriage after carriage went down the embankment. Some struck the stone parapet of the canal bridge as they fell. Others went further, breaking through the ice on the Oxford Canal itself and coming to rest half in the frozen water. Of the 15 vehicles that had left Oxford 3/4 of an hour before, only 4 remained on the rails behind the engines. Everything else lay broken along the embankment or in the canal below. The telegraph wires that ran alongside the line, the fastest means Victorian Britain had of sending word from one place to another, were themselves torn down in the collision, so that, even as the wreck lay smoking and silent in the Oxfordshire cold, the news of what had happened there could not yet travel any faster than a person on foot or on horseback. Word of the worst disaster in the Great Western Railway's history would have to reach Oxford the old way, carried by a human being running toward the nearest place with a working telegraph key, while the passengers who had survived the fall down that embankment began, in the wreckage and the freezing air, to look for whoever they had been travelling with. The village of Shipton on Cherwell was close enough to hear it happen. Within minutes, ordinary residents of Shipton and the neighbouring hamlet of Hampton Gay were making their way down, toward the embankment and the canal, working by instinct rather than by any plan, because nothing in a small Oxfordshire parish could have prepared anyone for what they found there. A doctor happened, by chance, to be visiting a patient in Shipton that afternoon. He reached the wreck within about 5 minutes of the crash and began treating the injured on the spot, splinting broken limbs in the open air with whatever could be found, working without the equipment of a hospital because a hospital was miles away and there was no time to wait for one. Word of the disaster could not travel by telegraph, since the wires themselves had come down with the train, and so the doctor's train, that should have followed quickly from Oxford, was slower to arrive than it ought to have been, leaving the earliest hours of the rescue to the people who happened to already be nearby. Among them was Robert Langton Pearson, who ran the paper mill at Hampton Gay and lived in the adjoining manor house, a building already 3 centuries old by that Christmas. Pearson opened his mill to the disaster without hesitation, and it became, in the space of an afternoon, a mortuary and a treatment room at once. 26 bodies were carried there and laid out for identification. His workers, men who had begun that day making paper, spent its remaining hours instead carrying the dead and tending the injured, doing whatever needed doing. Roughly 70 of the injured were eventually moved on to Oxford, travelling the last stage of their Christmas Eve journey, not in the crowded, cheerful train they had boarded that morning, but in whatever vehicles could be found to carry the wounded. 4 of them did not survive that short remaining journey. 53 were taken in and treated at the Radcliffe Infirmary, the city's hospital, its wards filling that evening with patients who had left home only hours before, expecting nothing more than an ordinary journey to relatives for Christmas. At Hampton Gay, a landlady named Mrs. Mitchell, who kept the boat inn at Thrupp, a short distance from the crash site, took in a small child found in the wreckage, a girl of about 2 years old, unhurt but entirely unable to say who she was or where she belonged. Mrs. Mitchell cared for her over the following days, feeding her, keeping her warm, waiting for someone to come and claim her. That child was Lizzie Yeats. Her mother, Sarah, had been killed in the collision. Her sister, 5-year-old Fanny, had been gravely injured and would linger for a week before she too died on the 31st of December without ever regaining consciousness. It fell to James Yates, William's brother, to travel from Wolverhampton once word reached him, to walk among the rows of the dead laid out at Hampton Gay and identify who he could. The inquest opened at the manor house there on the 26th of December, 2 days after the crash, and on that first day alone, James Yates and other relatives formally identified 16 of the 34 who had died. Others were identified in the days that came after, some at Oxford railway station itself, some at the Radcliffe Infirmary, as families arrived from across the region to find out whether the person they were looking for was among the dead, among the injured, or in the case of Sarah Yates's youngest daughter, safe and unharmed but unable to tell anyone her own name, until her uncle finally reached the boat inn at Thrupp and recognised her. The formal inquiry into what had happened fell to the Board of Trade and specifically to Colonel William Yolland of the Railway Inspectorate, a man whose job it was to travel to the sites of Britain's worst railway accidents and establish, with as much precision as the evidence allowed, exactly what had gone wrong. Yolland's Court of Inquiry sat in parallel with the coroner's inquest that had already opened at Hampton Gay, gathering testimony from surviving passengers, from Great Western Railway staff, and from engineers who examined what remained of carriage 845 and the length of track it had run before finally leaving the rails. His report was published on the 27th of February 1875, a little over 2 months after the crash. Its central finding was, in its way, almost anticlimactic. The tyre on carriage 845 had failed because of metal fatigue, a fracture that had likely been developing for some time, worsened by the cold and by ordinary wear, and undetectable by any inspection method available to the railway in 1874. Nobody had missed an obvious warning sign. Nobody had ignored a crack anyone could have seen. The wheel had simply failed in a way that the science of the day could not yet predict. That alone might have made the disaster a tragic accident and little more. But Yolland's report did not stop there, and this is where the inquiry's findings turned from an account of bad luck into an account of institutional failure. The reason a single fractured tyre had killed 34 people and injured 69, Yolland found, was not the fracture itself, but everything the railway had failed to build around it. Had the train carried a continuous brake, one that could be applied instantly and simultaneously to every carriage, the moment something went wrong, the driver might have brought the whole train to a stop within the 300 yards that carriage 845 ran before it finally left the rails. Had there been a reliable means of communication between the rear of the train and the men driving it, the alarm raised somewhere near the back might have reached the front in time to matter. Neither existed. Both had been available in workable form for years. Neither had been required by law, and neither had been fitted. Not out of malice or particular carelessness on the part of the Great Western Railway, but because in 1874 fitting them remained entirely optional, a matter left to each company's own judgment of cost against risk. No single Great Western official was named, blamed, or prosecuted as a result of Yolland's findings. There was no individual villain for the inquiry to identify, no manager whose signature could be pointed to as the cause. That absence of a single guilty name was in its own way the most damning finding of all, because it meant the failure belonged not to one careless man, but to an entire industry's working assumptions. The same assumptions that had left obsolete wheel designs still in daily service, and had left continuous brakes as something railways might adopt eventually, when they judged it worth the expense. Shipton on Cherwell was not, as it turned out, an isolated case. The 1870s would go on to produce a string of serious British railway disasters cut from strikingly similar cloth. Among them, the Abbott's Ripton crash of 1876, each one adding its own weight to a mounting body of evidence that the industry's voluntary approach to safety was not working. Colonel Yolland's report on the Christmas Eve wreck near Oxford became one part of that slowly accumulating case, a case that Parliament, for all the evidence already in front of it, would take another 15 years to fully act upon. That 15 years ended in Ireland, not England, and with a death toll far higher than the one at Shipton on Cherwell. The disaster that occurred at Armagh in June of 1889 struck a train crowded with ordinary passengers, not unlike the one aboard the Birkenhead Express 15 years before, and it killed far more people than had died on Christmas Eve in 1874, a toll that made the reckoning impossible for the country to avoid any longer. It was, in its particulars, a different accident from the fractured tyre that had brought down carriage 845, but it turned on the same absent safeguard that Colonel Yolland had already identified in his report on Shipton on Cherwell a decade and a half earlier, a train that could not be stopped instantly as a single connected unit the moment something went wrong. It was that repetition, disaster after disaster, turning on the same missing mechanism, that finally moved Parliament to act where individual inquiry reports, however clear their findings, had not been enough on their own. 79 days after the Armagh disaster, the Regulation of Railways Act of 1889 received royal assent. For the first time, British law required every passenger train to carry a continuous, automatic brake, one that could be applied by a single action to every carriage simultaneously, one that would apply itself automatically if a coupling or a brake line ever failed or parted, so that a broken connection produced a stopped train rather than a runaway one, and one that had to be in daily use, not simply fitted and forgotten. The same act required the interlocking of signals and points and block working on passenger lines, closing off entire categories of accident that had, for decades, been left to chance and to the discretion of individual companies. It is worth understanding what that single piece of legislation actually changed, because its effects did not end in 1889. The continuous, automatic brake mandated by that act is the direct ancestor of the braking systems still legally required on every passenger train running in Britain today, the vacuum and air brakes of the following century, and the fail-safe electro-pneumatic systems that succeeded them. It is the reason a modern train, if a coupling fails or a brake line parts anywhere along its length, does not run on uncontrolled. It stops. The whole train stops instantly and together, because the system is built to fail safe rather than to fail open. Every person who has ever felt a train brake smoothly and completely to a halt without a passenger, a guard or a driver at the back doing anything at all to make it happen has relied, without knowing it, on a legal requirement written into being because trains like the one that left Oxford on Christmas Eve 1874 had no such protection, and paid for its absence in lives. Sarah Yates and her daughter Fanny were buried together in the churchyard at Hannington, in a row of family graves that already held the daughter the family had lost the spring before. Their headstones still stand there, recording between them the date of a Christmas that had begun as an ordinary journey home and ended instead as one of the worst disasters in the history of the Great Western Railway. The site of the crash itself carries almost nothing to mark what happened there. The wooden bridge that once carried the line over the Oxford Canal has long since been replaced by a modern metal structure, and the railway embankment beneath it remains in active use to this day, trains passing over the same stretch of ground where carriage 845 came apart, with no plaque, no marker, nothing to tell a passenger looking out of a window that this quiet piece of Oxfordshire once held one of the worst disasters in the Great Western Railway's history. Robert Pearson's paper mill at Hampton Gay, the building that had opened its doors within minutes to take in the dead and the injured, did not long outlast the disaster it had briefly sheltered. In November of 1875, less than a year after that Christmas Eve, the mill burned down, and it never recovered its former trade. Pearson himself, the man who had given his workplace over to strangers in their worst hour without a moment's hesitation, was declared bankrupt in 1882. The manor house, beside the mill, the same building where the inquest had opened just 2 days after the crash, where James Yates had walked among the dead to find his brother's wife, fared no better in the end. On the 29th of April 1887, the manor house at Hampton Gay burned down as well. It was never rebuilt. What remains today is a ruined shell, roofless, its walls still standing over the same stretch of countryside that once looked down on the wreckage of a Christmas train, a house that opened its doors to the dying and now stands empty itself, watched by nobody, visited by almost no one. Outside, a small circle of local historians in Oxfordshire and the railway enthusiasts who keep track of Britain's engineering past in its fullest detail. The Shipton on Cherwell crash of 1874 has largely slipped out of public memory altogether. It left no famous memorial, no annual service, no name that most people driving or travelling through that part of Oxfordshire today would recognise. It survives mainly in a handful of careful local histories, drawn from parish registers, from the pages of Jackson's Oxford Journal and the Times as they reported it that Christmas week, and from the official report Colonel Yolland filed 2 months after the wreck. The kind of quiet, thorough documents that outlast the disasters they describe long after the disasters themselves have been forgotten by everyone except the people still willing to go looking for them. The fullest account of what happened that Christmas Eve did not appear in any grand history of British railways. It came from a slim, carefully researched paper produced by the Fairford History Society, drawing on parish registers, census returns, and the newspaper columns of 1874 to reconstruct a story that national accounts of Victorian railway disasters mostly reduced to a death toll and a date. A separate, more technical study, published more than a century after the crash under the title Wheels to Disaster, returned to the same wreck from an engineer's point of view, tracing the specific metallurgical failure inside that single tyre with a precision that the Board of Trade's own investigators, working in the winter of 1874 and 1875, could never have managed. Between them, these later patient re-examinations are largely what keep the story from disappearing altogether. Without them, Shipton on Cherwell would likely have joined the long list of Victorian rail disasters remembered, if at all, only as an entry in a table of statistics, one line among dozens of similar crashes from a decade when British railways killed with a regularity that would be unthinkable today. It has none of the name recognition of the Tay Bridge disaster 5 years later, none of the enduring public fascination that followed some of the larger wrecks of the same era. It survives instead in local archives, in the patient work of historians who considered 34 ordinary lives worth the effort of remembering properly, one name and one parish record at a time, long after the railway itself had rebuilt its bridges, replaced its wheels, and moved on. Word of what had happened reached Hannington by the same halting means that carried it everywhere else. That Christmas, delayed by the broken telegraph lines, and travelling instead by messenger and rumour before any official confirmation arrived. William Yates, still at the Dog, still keeping the public house through what should have been an ordinary busy Christmas Eve for a village inn, learned only gradually and only incompletely what had happened to the wife and daughters he had waved off that morning. There was no single moment of certainty for him, no clean announcement. There was instead the slow, cruel arithmetic of a small village learning of a distant disaster in pieces. A name confirmed here, a detail corrected there, while a husband and father waited at home for information that could only travel as fast as another human being could carry it. It fell to his brother James to make the actual journey to Oxfordshire, to stand in the room at Hampton Gay where the dead had been laid out, and to do the thing a family member should never have to do at Christmas. William himself remained in Hannington. Within days he would be arranging a funeral for a wife and a daughter in the same churchyard where he had already buried one child 9 months before, a village innkeeper, doing quietly and without any public record of his private grief what thousands of other Victorian parents and husbands did in the aftermath of a century that killed by railway, by mine, and by mill with an indifference that rarely made room for any individual family's sorrow. By 1874, the Great Western Railway was not a small or obscure concern. It was one of the great institutions of Victorian Britain, already decades old and running one of the largest railway networks in England, linking Oxford and Birmingham to London and to towns across the West Country, carrying not just passengers, but the coal, the mail, and the manufactured goods that a rapidly industrialising nation depended upon to function. It employed thousands of men, from the engineers who designed its locomotives to the porters who loaded parcels onto trains, like the one that left Oxford that day, and it had, by the standards of its era, a reputation for solid, competent, unglamorous reliability rather than recklessness. That reputation mattered, because it meant the Great Western was not some marginal operator cutting corners out of desperation. It was, if anything, representative of exactly how a well-run, respected, financially sound British railway company approached questions of safety in the 1870s, cautiously, incrementally, and always with an eye to cost, upgrading equipment and practice only as fast as it judged necessary, rather than as fast as the available engineering allowed. A company with the resources of the Great Western could in principle have fitted continuous brakes to its passenger fleet years before Christmas of 1874. It had the money. It had engineers capable of designing and installing such a system. What it did not have was any external pressure, legal or otherwise, requiring it to spend that money before an accident made the case for it in the most brutal terms possible. Colonel Yolland's inquiry drew out exactly this point in the testimony he gathered from Great Western staff and from independent railway engineers called to give evidence. Witnesses described, in the flat technical language of Victorian engineering testimony, wheel designs already in use elsewhere that used a composite construction, combining wood, metal and rubber in ways intended to absorb stress more evenly than a simple iron tyre, and reduce exactly the kind of fatigue failure that had brought down carriage 845. These were known in the trade as Mansell wheels after the engineer who had developed them, and Yolland's report recommended their wider adoption in terms that left little room for misreading. The accident at Shipton on Cherwell was, in his professional judgment, a demonstration of what the older wheel and tyre design could still do, even on a well-maintained line run by a well-regarded company, and a case for moving away from it as quickly as practicable. Evidence was also given on the question of communication between guard and driver, with witnesses describing experiments then underway on the Great Western and on other lines, with a system of electric bells and telegraphic signalling that could, in principle, let a guard at the rear alert a driver at the front, within seconds rather than depending on a cord pulled hard enough to ring a distant gong over the roar of a moving engine. None of these systems were yet standard. All of them were, in 1874, still optional, still experimental, still a matter for each company's own engineers to trial at their own pace and their own expense. Precisely the arrangement that had left the guard on the Birkenhead Express, with nothing faster than a rope and a bell to warn two engine crews that the train behind them was coming apart. The crush of third-class passengers that had forced Oxford Station to find one extra carriage that morning said something about how far railway travel had spread through English society by 1874. A journey that would once have belonged only to the prosperous was, by then, within reach of clerks, tradesmen, farm labourers, and publicans' wives travelling with young children, provided they were willing to sit in the plainest carriages the company offered. Third-class compartments in this period were simple wooden benches, unheated, often without upholstery, built to a standard that prioritised capacity over comfort, and on the Birkenhead Express that Christmas Eve, 6 of the 15 vehicles in the train were given over entirely to this class of ticket, more than any other single category of carriage on board. It was, in other words, an ordinary working family's train as much as anyone else's, filled that day with people who had saved for a ticket home, rather than people for whom the fare was no particular sacrifice. 2 first-class carriages and 2 second-class carriages carried the more comfortable end of that same crowd, alongside 2 composite carriages that mixed passengers of different classes within a single vehicle, a common enough arrangement on a busy route where demand for any one ticket type could shift from station to station. 3 brake vans positioned through and behind the passenger carriages carried luggage, parcels, and the guards responsible for working whatever brakes each van possessed independently of the others, since there was, as yet, no way to link one van's brake to the next. It was an entirely conventional train for its day, assembled from entirely conventional parts, carrying an unusually large number of entirely ordinary people home for Christmas. The coroner's inquest that had opened at Hampton Gay Manor House on the 26th of December, 2 days after the crash, did not conclude its business there. It reconvened afterward in Oxford itself, where the coroner's jury continued to hear evidence about the dead who had not yet been identified and about the circumstances of the crash more broadly, running in parallel with Colonel Yolland's separate Board of Trade inquiry rather than duplicating it. The jury's eventual findings did not assign personal criminal blame to any named individual, closing the coroner's proceedings and leaving the deeper question of institutional responsibility to Yolland's report and to the slower, more public reckoning that would only be settled by Parliament itself. Years later, once enough such findings had accumulated across enough such inquests that the pattern could no longer be read as anything other than systemic. Nobody who worked that day at Oxford Station kept an exact count of how many people had boarded the Birkenhead Express as it finally pulled away at 12:15. The press in the days that followed put the number at somewhere between 400 and 500 souls, a figure repeated across several papers covering the story that Christmas week, though even that estimate rested more on the general impression of a packed train than on any ticket count anyone had troubled to keep during the crush of a busy holiday departure. It hardly mattered, in the end, whether the true figure was closer to 500 or somewhat lower. What every account agreed on was the plain fact that the train had been carrying far more people than any ordinary working day would have put through those same 6 miles of Oxfordshire track, precisely because it was Christmas Eve, and precisely because that was the one day of the year when almost everyone who could travel chose to. News of the crash reached London in time for the Christmas Day and Boxing Day papers, and it landed with a particular force because of when it had happened. A railway disaster on an ordinary Tuesday in March might have filled a column and been forgotten within the week. A railway disaster on Christmas Eve, striking down families travelling specifically to be together for the holiday, was a different order of story, and Jackson's Oxford Journal and the Times both gave it the kind of sustained coverage usually reserved for events of national significance, printing what details of the dead and injured could be confirmed, appealing to readers for information about unidentified victims, and following the story for days, as identifications continued, and as the death toll, initially uncertain, climbed toward the final count of 34. For families across the country who had relatives travelling anywhere on the Great Western Network that Christmas, the newspaper reports produced a particular species of Victorian anxiety that no telephone or instant message could resolve. A father in Wolverhampton reading of a wreck near Oxford, with a wife or a sister known to be travelling that way, had no way to learn within minutes whether his own family had been aboard that specific train. He could only write or telegraph where a working line still permitted it, or simply wait, in the same halting, uncertain way that word had first reached William Yates at his own public house in Hannington, for confirmation that might take hours or days to arrive. It was this same uncertainty, multiplied across dozens of families with relations somewhere on the line that week, that filled Oxford's hotels and inns with anxious relatives in the days immediately after Christmas, arriving from Wolverhampton, from Birmingham, from villages across 3 or 4 counties, each of them making the same journey James Yates had made, toward the same uncertain answer. The Radcliffe Infirmary itself became, for those days, a place where that uncertainty was finally resolved one way or the other, ward by ward, as relatives arriving from further afield went from bed to bed looking for a face they recognised among the 53 patients being treated there. Doctors and nurses accustomed to an ordinary Christmas week of quiet wards found themselves instead managing a sudden influx of the seriously injured alongside a steady traffic of frightened, travel-worn visitors, each one hoping to find the person they were looking for alive, and each one aware that the alternative, confirmation among the dead at Hampton Gay, was just as possible an outcome of the journey they themselves had just made. By the time the last of the injured had been carried up from the canal and the embankment, daylight was already failing. Sunset on the 24th of December comes early in the English countryside, not long after 4 in the afternoon, and much of the work of freeing the trapped and comforting the injured was carried out as the light dropped away entirely, by lantern and by whatever candles could be found in the cottages of Shipton and Hampton Gay. Villagers who had never expected to spend their Christmas Eve this way brought blankets from their own homes, boiled water over their own fires, and carried it down to where the injured lay, waiting for a doctor's train that had not yet arrived, doing by instinct what no training had prepared them for, working through what should have been the quietest, warmest evening of their year. The frozen surface of the Oxford Canal, which had made the fall of several carriages that much harder, also made the recovery work that much slower. Rescuers working carefully across broken ice in the dark to reach carriages that had gone into the water, rather than simply down the embankment. It was exacting, dangerous work carried out by ordinary parish residents with no equipment beyond whatever tools a village blacksmith or a paper mill could supply, in temperatures cold enough that the same ice that had contributed to the original tyre failure now threatened anyone trying to work along its edge. Colonel Yolland, who arrived to take charge of the Board of Trade's inquiry once the immediate rescue was complete, came to the task with years of experience investigating exactly this kind of failure. The Railway Inspectorate to which he belonged had been established decades earlier, specifically because Parliament recognised that private railway companies, left entirely to their own devices, needed some independent professional body capable of examining a wreck, questioning those involved, and publishing findings the public and the industry alike could trust. Men like Yolland spent much of their careers travelling from one such disaster to the next, across the country, developing, crash by crash, an increasingly detailed understanding of exactly which mechanical and organisational failures kept recurring and exactly which recommendations kept being made and not adopted. That accumulated experience gave Yolland's report on Shipton on Cherwell a weight beyond the single incident it described, because Yolland himself could see, better than almost anyone else in Britain, the pattern connecting this crash to others before and after it. 5 years after his report on Shipton, the Tay Bridge disaster of December 1879 would kill a great many more, a disaster with different mechanical causes but the same underlying story, a piece of Victorian railway engineering that had been trusted further than its true margins allowed, inspected less rigorously than its importance demanded, and found wanting only after the deaths that followed had already occurred. Each of these disasters across the decade, different in its specific mechanism but identical in its shape, added its own weight to the case that voluntary good practice, however well-intentioned, was not sufficient to keep pace with the sheer scale and speed of what Victorian railways had become. In the years after Yolland's report on the Shipton crash, engineers continued pointing to workable, continuous brake systems already available and already used to some extent elsewhere, including the vacuum brake and the Westinghouse air brake developed in America. Both were capable of bringing a train to a stop in a fraction of the distance and the time that hand brakes alone required, applied by a single action instead of carriage by carriage. There was no serious dispute among engineers that the technology to prevent another Shipton already existed. What was missing was any requirement compelling a company to fit it. And still, for 14 more years, adoption remained a matter of individual company choice rather than legal obligation. Some railways, persuaded by the evidence, began fitting continuous brakes to at least part of their passenger fleets in the years that followed. Others moved more slowly, weighing the expense of retrofitting an entire network of rolling stock against the absence of any law compelling them to do so, and choosing, as the Great Western itself had chosen in 1874, to proceed at whatever pace the balance sheet allowed. It would take Armagh and the accumulated weight of every disaster in between to finally close that gap between what had already been proven possible and what the law actually required of every train carrying paying passengers across Britain. That gap was not merely a matter of engineering convenience. Every year it remained open was a year in which ordinary passengers boarded trains without any way of knowing whether the particular carriage they had chosen or the particular company running that day's service had yet made the investment that separated a train able to stop itself instantly from one that could not. A traveller in the 1880s buying a third-class ticket for a Christmas journey home had no practical means of finding out which kind of train she was boarding. No printed notice, no visible marking, nothing beyond trust that the company had done right by her. That invisible variation, hidden behind an ordinary ticket and an ordinary carriage door, is easy to overlook from a distance of a century and a half, but it was, for the length of that gap, the exact same invisible variation that had placed carriage 845, an older design than most of its neighbours, directly behind the two engines pulling the Birkenhead Express on the one morning it mattered most. When the last carriage finally came to rest that Christmas Eve, the clock at Oxford station would have read only a little past 12:30, a train barely begun on its journey, and already, in a matter of seconds, the worst disaster in the history of the Great Western Railway. 34 people who had left home that morning, expecting nothing more than a journey to relatives, did not complete it. A 5-year-old girl who had boarded with her mother and her younger sister did not come home for Christmas at all. Her sister did, carried the last part of the way by strangers who never asked to become part of her story, and raised, from that Christmas onward, by a father who had said goodbye to a wife and a daughter that morning and never fully got either of them back. None of it happened because of a storm, or an act of God, or an enemy of any kind. It happened because a single wheel gave way beneath an ordinary train, on an ordinary day, and because the industry running that train already knew, before it ever left Oxford, exactly what would have stopped the tragedy that followed, and had simply not yet been made to fit it. It would take 15 more years, and a great many more empty places, at a great many more Christmas tables, before the law finally caught up with what the engineers had already proven. Every train that stops today, instantly and completely, the moment something goes wrong along its length, carries that debt quietly with it, paid in full by people whose names, for the most part, nobody now remembers, in a wreck beside a frozen canal that most of Britain has long since forgotten ever happened at all.